All right. Yeah, thank you so much, Steve, for such a wonderful introduction. And it's really, really great to be able to present at, but also just attend Consciousness Club. It's been, I think, being in Australia, I've been watching from the sidelines for very long. So yeah, thanks so much for having me, and I'm really excited to present today as well. As Steve mentioned, my name is Daniel. I'm heading the Prediction Decision Making Lab at the University of Melbourne. And today I'll be talking to you a bit about some work we've done, sort of mixing confidence, certainty, and EEG. So just as a sort of starting point, my students have forbidden me from making any sort of reference to crossing the road when I have to explain decision making. So I had to do a more sort of Santorini themed example here. And this is also one that I encountered in my childhood as well. This is sort of going to the beach. And in this situation, you often need to sort of cross the sand and avoid the sharp rocks that might be lurking underneath in order to get to the cool ocean on the other side and sort of swim on a hot day such as today, at least in Greece. And there are a number of sort of decision scenarios that are relevant to the things I'll be talking about today. So for example, first you need to make a guess or an inference about where the soft sand will be and where the sharp rocks are hiding. But you also may need to adjust your decision-making strategies and especially your confidence in your stepping as you sort of move through this path closer to the water. So for example, you might be highly confident and step down only to realize there was a sharp rock. And once you've detected your error, you might be a little bit more cautious and explore your surroundings a bit more sort of tentatively in future. And this example, to sort of keep the Greek theme going, is very similar to the allegory of Plato's cave, which has been commonly used to sort of explain perception or the conundrum that we face. So on the right, we have this poor prisoner who is strapped to a rock, chained to a rock, and they cannot see what is going on behind them or what is going out in the real world. And they need to interpret this by looking at the shadows dancing across the cave wall produced by the person on the left. And our brains are a little bit like these poor prisoners in the sense that we're stuck inside our skull, a sort of cave. And instead of lights and shadows on a cave wall, we need to interpret the patterns dancing across our retina instead. And so this sort of inference problem or best guessing problem also has a dimension to it in which we can be highly certain about what we're seeing. So for example, this bird here, and we can be sort of progressively less certain about what we're seeing and have less confidence in the decisions that we make. So to put a formal definition on what I'll be talking about today, I'm going to define decision confidence as the subjective probability that one's decision is correct, rewarding, or appropriate for the task at hand. And this can be understood as a type of belief that somebody may hold about their own decisions in relation to the world. And we can also dissociate this from things like certainty that sort of pop up in the predictive processing literature and other areas. So for example, you can be highly certain that you're wrong, meaning that you have a low confidence in you having made a correct decision, but high certainty that you'd made an error. And we typically sort of try to elicit and manipulate confidence ratings in a very similar scenario to Plato's cave. Instead of sort of a fire and this silhouette, we use computer screens and a projector, and people press buttons to signal their percepts in the task. So in those types of things experiments I'll be talking about today, we typically manipulate the discriminability of a critical stimulus in some way. And in each trial, we present the stimulus, get people to make a two alternative false choice, and then get them to rate their confidence on some sort of scale, where this scale can range from unsure to certainly correct, but also can allow for error detection or signaling an incorrect decision by allowing this sort of certainly incorrect side. And here we can define, or at least for the purposes of this talk, I'll define confidence going from low to high across this scale. Error detection and change of mind broadly sitting in the sort of certainly incorrect to unsure portion of the scale. And then certainty split into two types of concepts. So you can have certainty in having made an error, or that it was not a dog in this case. And then on the other side of the scale, the certainty that you had made a correct response. There are also instances in which people do give simultaneous confidence and choice, but I'm not going to be talking about these so much today. Okay, and so I think everybody has their own motivations for confidence, and I might be preaching to the choir here, but I'm personally really interested in it, in that it's sort of known as a third variable in a lot of mathematical psychology. So usually we have choices, response times, and when these don't give us enough information that we want, we go to confidence ratings to try to educate between models. And the reason why this is useful is that the confidence tends to have these observable patterns of covariation, or what we call joint distributions, which are really useful for fitting these types of formalized models. So sort of as another example, I come from a very heavy sort of modeling focus in my department, and they don't like sort of simple differences like mean RTs, but they love these sort of very complex patterns of effects, such as sort of RT quantile by error, these QQ plots that they can use to try and better constrain these types of models. And just as an example of how these joint patterns sort of occur and how they might be really useful, here's an example from some recent work we've done looking at the effect of absolute evidence, also sometimes known as a positive evidence bias, on joint patterns of these sorts of things. So, for example, here we have on the left correct, and then on the right error trials. And here we have what I call conditional confidence plots, which show sort of confidence ratings or mean confidence ratings for different RT quantile bins in different conditions. So here we can immediately see that there are differences across correct and error trials in people's confidence, but also this sort of gradual reduction in confidence that occurs when people make slower responses. And then on top of this sort of effect of absolute evidence or positive evidence that seems to be independent from this. And by creating these types of plots, we can provide a lot of nice fodder for, constraining these types of models that we might be interested in. Of course, this is a new approach. This has been done since time immemorial. Here's an example from Vickers and Packer, looking at confidence in the speed accuracy trade-off. And of course, this reflects is reflected in the recent sort of analysis work on the confidence database, showing these correlations between choice RT and confidence ratings in some, but not all tasks. And as I mentioned, these are really useful for informing these types of process models, ranging from things like signal detection theory that have been nicely used to account for sort of choice proportions in different types of tasks, and then expanding these to account for confidence and the different sources of information that may contribute to these judgments, and also to things like evidence accumulation models, such as the diffusion model shown here. And I'll talk about this a little bit more. But generally, the diffusion model has been conceptualized in sort of choice behavior, at least, as a sort of natural process as a process that sort of naturally produces a lot of the types of distributions that the SDT handles. Of course, this provides a bit of a bridge to link confidence and things like adaptive decision-making, so how we might adapt certain aspects of our decision-making over trials based on the confidence that we have. And also linking this to things like changes of mind, so how we might rapidly adjust or sort of reverse our decisions after we've made an error. And this has produced a really nice, fruitful sort of initial work looking at these sort of change of mind models from Resselage, and more recent work we've done trying to account for RT distributions as well. And, there's sort of deep links to confidence theoretically in this space. Finally, confidence is also exciting sort of to me, and I hope to you, because it really makes us confront this idea of the criterion problem, or how we have a number of different sort of criteria, or how we produce different subjective ratings. So again, the math psych literature, there's a long history of using sort of multiple boundaries to indicate when people give different levels of confidence. And the sort of hope implicit in this is that we might be able to use confidence as a bridge to also create better measurement theory for these types of subjective ratings. Experiments where subjective ratings are given, such as how much you might want to drink a can of Coke. And then this, of course, links to sort of the debates around consciousness and how we can relate people's subjective reports to, whether they had or had not become consciously aware of a stimulus that was presented. I won't go into that too much today, but just indicating that, trying to understand how these reports are generated and what informs them seems to be quite relevant for this. And also other models like this cute little model we did, trying to also predict, when people become consciously aware of things as well. So in this talk, this will be a combination of sort of model-derived theory and a little bit of psychophysics combined with EEG to try to sort of better, hopefully inform or constrain some of the models that we have. All right. So I'll begin here by covering a couple of things. The first thing we'll look at is these different types of models that we'll focus on in the talk that have been developed and proposed to explain confidence in relation to EEG. And I see there's a few people in the audience who have done some really fundamental work contributing to this, so thank you for that in advance. All right. And just sort of to anchor things as well, I'll note that this sort of discussion will follow the trajectory of a paper that we recently published. And I just want to acknowledge Mackenzie, who is now doing her Masters of Cognitive Science at UCL, and Alex, who really got this experiment working, which is not easy for confidence studies, as you may know. And of course, Stefan, who hired me as a postdoc to do this work and remains a close collaborator on these topics. Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you today about is mainly theory centered around evidence accumulation models. And for those who are unfamiliar with these are sort of a basic conceptual and mathematically formalized understanding of decision-making dynamics based on a number of roughly discrete stages. So here we have the stimulus encoding stage on the left. So information travels through our retina and our visual cortex. And then this is thought to be sort of fuel a representation that we sample from to accumulate evidence about our choices. Once we have enough evidence for a certain decision, this decision is made, and then we execute this via a mode of action. This has also been expanded from discrete choice decisions to things like continuous report choices in recent work. So here's some work by Philip Smith and colleagues in my department who developed the circular diffusion model. And I guess one of the nice things about these models and why they've been useful for developing sort of accounts of different things is that they take these distributions of responses or proportions of responses at signal detection theory and other accounts have really nicely delineated and showed how these and also the speed at which people respond can be accounted for by this type of diffusive evidence accumulation process. So on the left, we have the discrete choice, and on the right, we have the continuous report. And then also the types of response time quantile distributions that they might capture as well. And so I think the hope with a lot of this type of modeling is that we might also be able to account or create compelling accounts of confidence judgments in this way. Although I think as sort of Steve's work has shown, it's usually a little bit more complicated than that. And these sort of models have been broadly split into pre- and post-decisional locus models of confidence. So if you imagine the choice is at this point here in the circle, we can broadly think of pre-decisional models as describing or sort of focusing on processes leading up to the decision itself. And then post-decisional, really focusing on processes that may occur sort of simultaneous to, sort of around the type of the buildup of the mode of action, but also sort of things that may occur after the choice has been made. I realize that these are sort of fairly broad distinctions, and a lot of models encompass both of these as well. And these fairly roughly correspond to these types of first order and post-decisional locus models in the Fleming and Bill paper. So going to the sort of pre-decisional or focusing on the unfolding decision at first, there are a number of different models that have been proposed for this. I can't cover all of these, so I'm sorry if I've missed some important ones, but I'll sort of take some examples to get the core principles and how they relate to the EEG data. So as one quite influential model, early model was by Vickers and Packer in 1982, and sort of various other papers that they had developed. So in this one, they got around the idea that, so there's in standard diffusion models, there is this general idea that you need to reach a fixed degree of evidence accumulation before you can make a choice, which makes sort of differing amounts of evidence accumulation difficult to account for in relation to confidence. Instead, they proposed a race type model. So here we have two accumulators that are sort of racing up to the same bound. And they define confidence broadly as the sort of difference in the degree of evidence accumulated for the winner compared to the loser in this two-choice scenario. So dog has a lot more evidence than cat, so we have a fairly high degree of confidence in this instance. Instead, if we look at post-decisional models, we also see something looking at the evidence accumulation dynamics. But instead, these models extend the trajectory of these beyond the time of the initial choice. So this is sort of really classic paper by Moran and colleagues, looking at the idea of sort of evidence accumulation that persists beyond the initial choice that has been made, and a number of sort of distinct thresholds that might be enforced that sort of map onto the criteria for different confidence judgments. So in blue, for example, we have quite a degree of evidence accumulated in favor of one's choice. So you might give a higher confidence rating than in the red one, for example. And this has also been generalized in relation to EEG data by Descender and colleagues, where they sort of broadly mapped this idea of sort of evidence in favor of or against somebody's initial choice to their sort of degree of confidence on these sort of continuous rating scales. So naturally, with these types of models, they specify processes that occur at fairly sort of discrete and specific times in relation to the commitment to a decision. And this has made them natural targets for EEG and other electrophysiological methods with fairly high temporal resolution. I'll be focusing on this today. Sorry for all the beautiful fMRI work that has been done, which has added, I think, a complementary, another whole different perspective, but other people have also already presented a lot of that great work. And so we have a couple of questions that link confidence in EEG. The first being, what are sort of the neural correlates of decision confidence, or what signals correlate with confidence reports? And also, how do these align with processes specified in these sort of existing models that have been developed based on behavioral data? All right. So before we sort of start, I will be covering a number of studies, and I will also be critiquing them or offering alternative versions of that. So just at the start, I want to say that our study was definitely standing on the shoulders of giants, some of them that are in this room. And I just want to say that I really appreciate the really, really high quality and clear work that has made it possible to build off of those papers as well. So this is really sort of another in the chain of this unfolding topic. And by critiquing these, I don't mean any disrespect, or I don't mean that they were bad studies. They're certainly fantastically designed. So looking at pre-decisional models, there have sort of been a really nice line of evidence linking some ERP components to sort of processes occurring during this time. And this has partially stemmed from the discovery or the uncovering of ERPs that typically track or are thought to track the sort of trajectory of evidence accumulation in relation to an initial choice. And I'll be focusing on the centroparietal positivity component for this talk. So if you're unfamiliar with this, here's a really sort of classic example by O'Connell and colleagues, in which people looked at a sort of flickering disk, and they needed to report when the contrast of this disk started gradually decreasing over time. And when they split the stimulus-locked ERPs by RT, so fast, medium, and slow, they found these sort of trial averaged trajectories of a centroparietal component that mimicked what we might expect trial averaged evidence accumulation trajectories in, say, the diffusion model with a single detection bound. And in addition, when they locked these to the time of the response, they saw this fairly typical sort of accumulation to threshold type morphology, where the build-up rate was also quite slightly faster for relatively quicker responses. And this showed a fairly nice sort of time locking to the time of the response, and a really nice clear centroparietal distribution congruent with the P3 or also the P3B. We've also replicated some of this in our lab in different types of tasks, which is nice. And based on these observations, people have made inferences based on the observed morphology of these components. And there's a couple of sort of basic things that people have pulled out. The first is looking at the slope of the CPP has been broadly correlated in quite a lot of studies to the drift rate in things like such as the diffusion model, but also the sort of amplitude immediately prior to the response has thought to be some sort of a correlate of the extent of evidence that has been accumulated immediately prior to the time of the action. So here we're accounting for a small sort of delay that is required for executing a hand response, for example, and looking at the window just before that delay. Of course, this has also been, well, not of course, but this has also been extended to things like continuous report tasks in some of our recent work that we're very excited about. So we also see very similar ERP correlates in these sort of color judgment tasks where people need to look at a single color in the center and report that using a fast mouse movement on a response wheel and watch this space. Some critics, which I think is justifiably so, may sort of say, you know, does this thing looks like the thing in the model? Is that, you know, are you just sort of looking at animals in clouds? And to that, I'd sort of like to say that, to me at least, I've seen that it exhibits a close enough covariation with the trajectory of the decision variable in these evidence accumulation models that I'm comfortable using these as a proxy, but it is based on that assumption that they are tracking this thing. So coming back to our sort of Vickers and Packer model, now we turn to a really, really great study by Manuel Rausch, I think is in the room today. And this is sort of exemplary of a lot of other studies that have been done in this space. And I particularly like the modeling work in this, and this is why I'm presenting it today. So in their study, they had a target which could either be vertical or horizontal stripes, but was subsequently masked. And here the target could be presented from very brief to slightly longer duration, so between 16 and 133 milliseconds. And then after this, people could give a confidence judgment ranging from not at all to completely sure. As you might expect, that with longer stimulus exposure durations, people became more confident. However, this was also the case for incorrect as well as correct responses here as well, which I think there's maybe some interesting sort of interpretations of that. But yeah, anyway. And so they looked at ERPs then, which were time locked to the onset of the target stimulus. And so I'm going to flip this just because I'm not used to looking at positive down ERPs, but you can sort of see which one you like. So here we saw a really nice sort of graded effect during the time window shaded in gray based on people's confidence reports. So when they were not at all confident, it was very tiny. And when they were very confident, they had this really nice potential. And this has been, similar approaches have been taken in other studies as well, going back to sort of Squires in 1973, and is broadly congruent with the idea that the degree of accumulated evidence might be reflected in the amplitude of this component, congruent with the Vickers and Packer model. So there are a number of sort of things that complicate the interpretation of this, and I'll go through these just now. So the first is that in these types of speeded response tasks, confidence does show a fairly stable relationship with RT in that, for example, this example from Yu Hong's study, that people get a little bit less confident when they're slower for both correct and error trials. And although this sort of can vary across studies. And the reason why this is important is that we need to sort of, this will also influence the types of distributions of stimulus-locked ERPs that we see. So if something's very tightly time-locked and very close, we'll see these ERPs early. But when they're more spread out, they'll be later and perhaps of lower amplitude. And as an example of this, we can go to the sort of classic study of Kelly and O'Connell, where they basically got people to watch patterns of randomly moving dots and then press a button whenever they had detected that some portion of these dots were moving either left or right. And here I will say that they modulated the coherence of the dots across many different levels. And they didn't measure confidence specifically, but here coherence usually tightly sort of correlates with confidence in these tasks. So it is sort of caution for concern, even if not definitive. And so in the RTs, you can see that people were faster and a bit more better at detecting things as the coherence increased. And looking at the ERPs, we can see that when you time lock it to the stimulus onset, when you have higher coherence, you see this sort of earlier peaking and much larger amplitude ERPs. But when we time lock this to the response instead, we see that immediately prior to the decision, that these are of sort of a fairly consistent amplitude across the different conditions. And so this is important because in these sort of models, what we typically care about is the amount of evidence accumulated, at the time of a decision, which is better time locked to the response. And the differences in the time of the decision relative to the stimulus can sort of produce these sort of weird patterns of ERPs in some cases. The other thing that was relevant to this is also from their study, was that they identified a peculiar and very annoying aspect of the ERPs, in that when we have a look at the CPP at the time of a response, you see this beautiful parietal distribution, as we would expect it to be. But when they looked at the effect of coherence, again, closely correlating with confidence in many instances, you can see that the amplitude modulations are actually a little bit more frontal, but spread quite across the scalp. And so in this case, they had sort of concluded that there is this sort of separate frontal component which messes around with CPP amplitudes and can mess with your amplitudes more posteriorly if you're not careful. Okay, going to the post-decisional stuff here before we get to my study. I'm going to mention another absolutely fantastic study that sort of broke open, I think, a lot of this field. And that was, or sort of a subsection of this field by Annika Bolt and Nick Jung. And they looked at ERPs following the decision in a sort of similar choice and confidence task. So in each trial, people looked at a dot stimulus and they needed to just say which had more dots in them. This is a very difficult task. And then they made a confidence judgment between certainly wrong and certainly correct. As one might expect, when they compared correct and error trials, this is time locked to the response and is positive down once again. They found that the error trials elicited a more positive going ERP than the correct trials in this case. So this is a fairly well replicated error positivity effect. But more interestingly, when they split this by confidence ratings, they saw that when sort of the ERPs corresponding to each rating gradually became more positive, this is sort of further down on this plot, when people were more certain that they were wrong compared to when they were more certain that they were correct. And this has been interpreted in some accounts as a sort of roughly monotonic relationship between these variables. And yeah, again, this has sort of been described in Descender and colleagues as a sort of key source of evidence of their account that the PE or the error positivity might reflect sort of post-decisional evidence accumulation that correlates with confidence and is specifically sort of framed in terms of detecting an error. All right, so again, this is another excellent study, but one thing that complicates this a little bit is the fact that in the sort of primary analyses that were done, they used a pre-response baseline. So this is subtracting the amplitudes prior to the response and then sort of aligning the ERPs like this. And this relies on the assumption that during this sort of purple shaded window, there are no systematic differences in amplitudes across these conditions that we might care about. Because if there are, this can unintentionally sort of propagate into the post-response time window and sort of mess around with your effects in ways that we don't like. So as an example of this that you might see later, from our data, here is an example where on the left, we used a baseline prior to the stimulus, and then a pre-response baseline on the right. And so on the left, you can see, as found, sort of as suggested by the Rausch study and others, there is a sort of difference in these parietal ERP components prior to the response. But when you subtract them out, it has a really insidious effect of sort of masking any differences prior to the response and propagating them after the response has been made and sort of producing some of these effects. The PE effect is real, like people have found it with using pre-stimulus baselines, but just here's a striking example of that effect of baselines. And we have a big rant about this in this commentary paper, if you're interested. Okay, so we wanted to know in our study, sort of accounting and keeping these things in mind, how the amplitudes of the CPP component, so this is during decision formation, and the post-decisional PE component covary with confidence, and what we might be able to do to sort of constrain some of the models that we have. And this was what I'll refer to as the confidence waffles study. So in this study, people watched sort of flickering played stimuli. These look a lot like waffles, and because I spent time in the other UCL in Belgium, I became very sort of, very fond of waffles, one a day. And so this study was born. And in these targets, this consisted of an inner circle. This is a target that contrast reversed at 20 Hertz, and an outer circle, which was a distractor that contrast reversed at 30 Hertz. We could frequency tag these, but we don't focus on these in our study. And so these consisted of planes, so sort of overlapping left and right oriented gratings, whereby in the outer circle, this was always 50-50, the contrast was the same, but in the inner circle, the target, the contrast of one of these could increase and the other would decrease. So in each trial, we saw a fixation cross, followed by a neutral stimulus for 1,000 milliseconds, then a target for 100 milliseconds. This was a very hard task and our participants hated us for it. And we adapted the stimulus, the contrast levels, using 3 interleaved staircases. So here we aimed for 60, 75%, and 90% accuracy to get a broad range of confidence ratings. After this, we had a neutral stimulus until the time of the response, or 900 milliseconds. And then after that, in half of the trials, which I'll focus on today, we had a neutral stimulus for another second. But then in the other half of trials, we actually presented another stimulus, which is 75% contrast. And that's meant to be 400 milliseconds, which was always congruent with the first target. So this essentially could allow people to know whether their first choice was accurate or not, and allow them to do things like detect errors and adjust their confidence. I've got the ERPs for this at the end if anybody wants to look at them. And then people made a confidence rating on a continuous scale. So they sort of moved the sliding window using their mouse, using keyboard buttons between certainly wrong and certainly correct, similar to the Bolton study. All right, so finally some results. When we looked at the sort of accuracy in RTs across staircase, we found what we expected to see. So in the more difficult conditions, people had lower correct proportion correct scores. And then they were also faster in the easier conditions as well. So, you know, they become more accurate and faster as it becomes more discriminable. And when we look at confidence, we see a pattern that is similar to the Fleming and colleagues' Nature Neuro paper, where essentially in correct trials, when the task gets easier, so again, staircase 3 is the easy one, people are more confident in their response for correct responses, but more often can detect the errors, or sort of are on average less confident when they had made an error in this case. We can also look at the conditional confidence plot. just to sort of see how that worked. And we can also see this sort of a slightly different pattern to what we've seen so far in the other figures, where both of these confidence, correct, and error sort of broadly converge towards completely uncertain, or this sort of zero confidence rating in the middle for relatively slower responses. And so people were better at detecting fast their errors when they were very fast at responding, and also better at determining that they'd made a correct response. And here are the RT distributions, if anyone's interested, just to show how that sort of varies across the confidence rating bands. All right, so focusing on the pre-decisional correlates of confidence first, we got ERPs and sort of in these trials, and we split them up in a number of different ways. So first, we wanted to check whether there was a difference in correct and error trials. If we didn't find this, this would be, this is sort of a basic sort of requisite, I think, of a correlative confidence. And here we saw that immediately prior to the response, that the CPP showed this sort of nice larger amplitude for correct responses compared to errors. And we saw that the distribution of this was fairly nicely sort of located parietally, where you would expect the CPP to occur. When we instead looked at confidence, we saw sort of a fairly similar pattern of results in our initial ERPs. One note here is that I've plotted these by median split high-low. These illustrates our pattern of effects, but we actually used regression models. So for each participant, we predicted the ERP amplitudes based on people's confidence ratings, and then looked at the betas at the group level to see if they differed from zero. And here, what we found is that, again, higher confidence had these more positive going ERPs around the time of the decision, which was great. The distribution of this was a little bit more spread out, though, which we'll come back to later. And then for errors, we also found a fairly similar pattern where they're a little bit more positive going when people had higher confidence. So this means sort of more certain they'd made a correct response, but also less certain that they'd made an error. And the scout map was a bit patchy for that. So I think this sort of shows a nice reinforcement of the initial sort of Rausch and colleagues data when the ERPs were response logged. And then next we looked at whether these reflect differences in the CPP itself. And so if you remember from the Kelly O'Connell type data, we saw sort of a difference in the distribution of amplitudes, or the distribution of the sort of component and these effects. And so we looked at whether we could also find these in our data. So here, for correct responses and errors, on the middle and on the right, these are sort of the intercepts and the mean amplitudes during the pre-response time window. We see these beautiful sort of parietally focused ERP components, indicative of the CPP. But then when we look at the correlations with confidence, we see this more sort of anterior, sort of frontocentralish distribution that also spreads back to these parietal channels. And so what we did here is we applied a CSD transformation. I won't get into this too much, but essentially it's designed to better sort of separate these sources of cortical potentials on the scalp. And then we could also look at these ERPs again to try to better sort of distinguish these frontal and more parietal effects. So here we find the same difference between correct and error responses, which is great. Although sort of some of this is a bit more posterior and there might be something funny going on there. And in addition, and inspired by the Kelly paper, we also looked at channel FCZ, a sort of more frontal amplitude, to see whether we'd see the ERP is sort of concentrated at this more frontal site. And here we found the same effect of sort of correct responses being more positive than errors. When we looked at confidence in this case, we no longer saw this clear amplitude difference or associations with confidence when we looked at these sort of CSD transformed ERPs. But when we look more frontally, we find this really clearly occurring and with a fairly sort of, clear amplitude differences. And then when we look at the scout maps, we almost see that the CPP electrodes, PZ is quite neglected, and we see more effects sort of at frontal sites here. And then when we look at errors, we didn't see much going on there for the CST transform data. Okay, so I realize I'm short on time, but I'm close to the end. So we did see these sort of apparent effects on the CPP, but no clear associations being confidence in the CPP in this sort of CST transform data, and an indication that there is a sort of frontal effect that co-occurs around the time of the response. And this is broadly congruent with decisional locus models in that they don't specify a specific neural correlate, just that there might be something, but it's not quite in line with the theoretical work linking the CPP and P3 components to this extent of evidence accumulation. So I think some more sort of attention should be paid here. And yeah, we identified a new-ish correlate of confidence, which is exciting. Looking at the post-decisional ERPs, so just to get you oriented here, we looked at this with the two baseline conditions. We didn't look at CSD, so you don't need to worry about that. So we looked at prior to the stimulus and then also prior to the response to see how these may be consistent or may differ. So for correct and error, I think I've already gone through this already. So we didn't find much of a difference in the pre-stimulus ERPs, but for the pre-response ERPs, we find this sort of difference to appear. And we see a similar effect with the confidence ratings as well. So here we have this nice clear pre-response effect that we talked about before, but nothing really happening in these sort of typical PE measurement windows. But then when we apply the pre-response baseline, sort of voila, this starts to appear. However, we see a slightly different story in the error trials. And so in these cases, we actually do see this association for both of these types of conditions as well. So it seems that there is some sort of correlation here for error trials in particular. And this actually accords really nicely with the Bolton-Young study in that here's a sort of response like PE when they used a pre-stimulus baseline. And you see this sort of really clear sort of amplitude modulation when they think that they were wrong, but not so much when they think that they're correct. Okay, and just to sort of finally, the last little bit of evidence, we also ran these analyses with restricted ranges. So here we chucked correct and error trials in and only looked at, for example, confidence responses ranging from unsure to certainly correct and unsure to certainly an error. And we find the sort of the same types of distinctions in these components as well. So here, the positive, the frontal component during the decision formation nicely correlated with this sort of unsure to certainly correct range. But then there was a negative correlation with this post-decisional PE component for unsure to certainly incorrect. And they didn't show correlations for the other side of the scale, which we think is pretty neat. So here we sort of find things that are partially congruent with the descender model. So here we can sort of frame this as, or interpret it as a marker of post-decisional evidence accumulation, particularly for errors, but it doesn't seem to show the sort of monotonic relationship across the sort of certainly correct to unsure to certainly error in the same way that they explicitly sort of predicted in their paper. So here we've sort of complicated the picture, if anything. We've found that we've sort of got distinct neural correlates of this certainty in having made a correct response and having detected an error. This is sort of, on one hand, you may say, well, of course, these might be distinct. If you think you're making an error, you probably won't make that decision. But we think it's sort of interesting and adds some nuance to sort of how we would relate ERPs to these types of models and what we might be able to learn from them. And so I think this, I want to tentatively say that it supports sort of at least two separable sources of evidence used to inform confidence judgments, and suggests that we may need to reinterpret and sort of reanalyze some existing data sets, or we might learn something from the really excellent experiment designs that people have used while recording EEG. And we're doing some work on this at the moment. And so, yeah, and we've sort of already replicated this in one study, at least using something similar to the Yu Hong's work. So there are a lot of sort of shortcomings with this that we can talk about in the discussion. Of course, correlation doesn't equal causation, and there's probably a lot of things that correlate with confidence and a whole bunch of different things in these tasks. So, you know, I feel like I'm sort of looking at these ERPs and making my own type of inference in Plato's cave. But I hope that we're getting closer from a sort of shadows dancing on the wall to a more fully fledged sort of description that can be complemented with other forms of data. All right, just to finish up, I'd really love to thank my collaborators. So Stefan, who took a chance on hiring me, Mackenzie and Alex, who got people to make reasonable confidence ratings, as well as a lot of the change of mind team distributed across Melbourne and Germany. And thank you so much for your attention, for hosting me. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and it's been a pleasure.
Great, thanks so much, Daniel. So first of all, we should unmute and give you a round of applause for a lovely talk. Okay, great. Such lovely work and such a rich talk as well. So lots of food for thought. Thanks for giving us a tour of the literature as well. So who wants to kick off? So we use the raise hand tool to manage the questions. I have plenty of questions, so maybe while people are thinking of them, I can jump in and start off. Well, I guess the first one is a bit on the behavioral side. There was this intriguing result that you had with response times, which looked to go against this idea from Tim Plaskap and co that the more time you spend post-decisionally, the better your metacognition becomes, and the better your sensitivity, essentially. Whereas it seemed like in your data you had the opposite, where you were good at distinguishing correct and error straight away, and then as time elapsed, things got worse. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on why there's two different potential results going on there.
Right. So I think I may have butchered that one. So I might quickly re-describe that and then come back to this question though. So with the RT plots with the I think the RT quantiles for correct and error. Quickly see if I can bring these up. Actually, no, I'm gonna stop that. So these were for the initial choice RTs. So that yeah. So I think.
Oh, I see. Okay. So not for post-decisional RT.
Oh no, those weren't. No, we didn't look. I think because we had a sort of sliding scale, we weren't able to look at those. And I've definitely been very interested in getting some really nice sort of time-locked estimates of those for future work. On that comment, and I know that I'm probably about 60 people who have more expertise on this than myself in here, but in relation to that, I sort of am reminded of an interesting sort of finding by one of the Descender papers looking at manipulating the time elapsed between the initial choice and the confidence judgment. I'm not sure if this was the one that you were looking at, referring to, but I think one of the really striking patterns of that is that people's confidence in having made a correct response, it differs a little bit. It does get a little bit more accurate, but the main sort of shift, which I think will drive people's metacognitive accuracy, is people's confidence when having made an error. They're much better at detecting these, and their confidence ratings sort of jump right down when they've had a bit of time to. And I don't know, maybe I'm sort of making a lot out of a molehill, but I found that really interesting that there may sort of be really distinct behavioral effects depending on what side of the confidence scale you look at.
Okay, great. And maybe just to follow up on that, so the other question I had was about whether this FCZ effect that you see peri-response is related to the theta modulation that Peter Murphy and co have looked at. So whether you've looked at time frequency analysis around that time of response.
Right. I think Vinay is in the audience actually. I think he did an honors project looking at something similar to this. I feel that the time frequency data that we had was a little bit, I think, too noisy to see sort of any clear correlations, and we haven't investigated that as much as we should. I suspect that that would be there. Definitely. One thing I'm kind of interested in with that design as well is that in those tasks, the task is explicitly in many cases to detect an error as well. So I am wondering if there's a sort of that's feeding into a quite different type of decision, I guess. But yeah, we've got our data online as well. So if anybody's interested, we'd be really interested to see what comes of that. Thank you. Sorry.
All right, great. So I see a couple of questions. So Claire, I think you're first.
Thanks, Daniel. That was incredibly interesting. I had a couple of questions relating to the motor side, actually. So with this separable component that you found to relate to the certainty in having made an error, to what extent can you figure out whether this is automatic motor preparation for then actually giving the alternative response? So, I mean, I know they can't in your task, but so do you think that this is what they're trying to do? They're trying to now actually go back and give the other response, because that's what you would typically do in an actual environment.
Yeah, I feel like that's a really plausible explanation, and you know, those sort of ongoing motor processes of I guess I feel like one blind spot in the work that we typically do with key presses is that we think that the motor restriction is limited to just this one point where people give some amount of force on a button, rather than this sort of temporally evolving thing. I feel like it could be something in addition to sort of error detection. People have talked about things like surprise or other things that may also correlate with this, you know, including sort of motor inhibition if people make an error when they don't usually make an error in a task. I do wonder whether some of these types of correlates of these other things may be responsible for this, and we're really interested to see, you know, when does this generalize, and you know, can we sort of pinpoint these other things? I have a feeling that we're not getting a correlate of purely sort of confidence, but maybe something that does align with that in that way. The parietal distribution gives me some confidence that it's sort of a little bit more posterior at least, but I'm sure that there has to be something going on there as well. Sorry, that's a bad answer to your question.
No, it's interesting. And the other motor question that's quite different actually was, so when you give these dual responses, so you give your decision and then you give your confidence, and you show the RT confidence correlations, to what extent is the fact that when you're slower, you're saying you're less confident, to what extent are you giving a readout of your motor response versus them both having this single generator of evidence accumulation? So meaning when you have given a slow response, you then say you were less confident because you had insight to the fact you were slow.
Right. I always get, if people have a good opinion on this, I'd really love to hear it, because I always get run around in circles when I think around this, and I've tried to solve this problem myself. But I feel that like there is that really nice sort of evidence. I mean, a lot of out of London actually, showing that, you know, motor response force correlates with confidence really nicely as well. We've done another study looking using dynamometers, so these sort of squeezy response force handles, where we sort of dictated the amount of force people needed to use after they'd made their initial choice. So they start squeezing, and they then the sort of threshold is presented. And we did find that has a small but consistent effect on confidence. So I'd be really open to that interpretation, I think. And yeah, we might be just sort of, but I don't know. Yeah, I guess the question there is that particular to instances where we have maybe a relationship between action fluency and things, or I mean, measuring things where people need to make a choice without giving a button press is a nightmare. But I wonder if that would go away if we didn't have that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Annika.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for a really interesting talk. I have two things. So first, a clarification and then a question, which is in a way linked to the question Claire just asked. So I think it might be good time to follow up now. So first, about the clarification about my own study. So the contamination issue, the question whether the pre-stimulus correlate of confidence contaminates the post-stimulus readout of these signals was something that we also were concerned about. And there's only one sentence about this in the paper, but there was I think a back and forth with the reviewers as well. So we replicate our analysis using a pre-stimulus baseline as well. So that kind of, in our case, we still found the effects, but of course this might not be the case in other data sets. But I know that we have a meeting next week, and I just send you my data so we can get to the bottom of this between us. The question I had is going back to this Sheffers and Cole's 2000 paper, the idea of these two types of errors. I don't want to see them as two classes. There could be more of a continuum here, but this idea that we have errors due to data limitation, where any amount of time does not lead to the right response because there's just not enough evidence there to sample from. And on the other hand, these lapses, these motor errors that Claire also just mentioned. So I really like this idea of these two components to certainty, and I quite buy that. So I was wondering whether you think for these two types of data of errors that the contribution pattern is almost inverse.
Right. So in the sense that the motor errors being sort of, or I guess in relation to the sort of perceptual uncertainty, that would be related, I guess, to the types of paradigms that, for example, yourself and we used, where we we almost don't give people enough information, I guess, to make decisions half the time anyway. But in relation to the motor, just for a bit of clarification there, are you mainly referring to the types of sort of flanker tasks or those instances where, okay, sorry, I might be...
No, I mean to premature responses. So people just pressing before they're ready. So these easily detectable errors. So I was thinking that they're driven by this certainty of being incorrect, whereas the data limitation errors are more driven by the certainty of being correct. So this more frontal other component that you introduced.
I see what you mean. I didn't look at this in as much detail as I'd like. I think maybe speaking to that, and again, sorry for another disappointing answer, but there's a really interesting sort of divergence in, especially Yu Hong's data, the absolute evidence data, because I looked at the conditional accuracy plots. So, so accuracy from fast to slow, and typically you get a little bit, when they're very, very fast, as you mentioned, they're not as accurate. And then they get a little bump for the middle RTs, and then they get a bit worse as they go down. But that little sort of decrease at the start, that's not in the conditional confidence, where it's almost like a straight line, and it almost doesn't, at least for correct responses, people are also like very blind that they might be making errors in that case. I think, I agree that it could be due to those fast errors, and I wish I had more data to sort of be able to tease these apart. Hopefully with some more data sets.
Topographies for the two classes of errors out of the data, that would be really cool, I think.
Yeah, that would be, I'm looking forward to our meeting where we, hopefully we've got a lot of data here. This could be a nice thing to look at.
Sounds good. Okay, so Kieran or the Tristan crew?
Hi. Yeah, I was going to make Kieran ask a question, but I think it would be fair if I ask the question. Hi. So I was going to make a theoretical point in terms of evidence, but first just a quick comment that we have joystick data similar to your squeezy data. So the same thing, right? You take one decision. If you go forward, the further you go, it's more confidence. So this idea of same action, two decisions. I think it's for another day of discussion, right? It's a methodological / conceptual sort of merge. Just that comment aside, I wanted to ask you if you think that any of your neural data or neural results speak to the idea that there is an accumulation of evidence towards the decision, towards the confidence decision early on. So if you think there is neural results that is already, being accumulated for the second decision,
Right there. Maybe I'll get ask Kieran to give the response to my question. Then maybe this is too mean. Yeah. So I'm really interested in these types of models that show sort of this almost parallel sort of certainty, I guess, as well in that, you know, the clarity of the decision and the decision itself. And I know that out of some labs, I think in terms of ERPs, Jason Mattingly's labs, so I think Dragan Rangelov have found sort of similar frontal things. They call it the CPP, but it's too anterior. In relation to this sort of certainty metric as well. I think one of the things that I always struggle with is that if we do have these parallel accumulators, whether like what sort of constraints can we put to differentiate these from these sort of fixed models? I know that Vickers and Packer in their models, they've sort of tried to account for this by the racing model where they have, you know, the two accumulators and they can sort of get confidence or certainty for free out of that distance. I think they have some peculiar patterns in the speed accuracy trade-off data that help support their account specifically rather than just say it's a correlative RT or something like that. But yeah, if you have any ideas or if you know of papers that have sort of really been able to find data patterns that distinguish these, I'd be really interested to know about them.
No, I don't actually. I was hoping you would have, or you know, someone in the audience would push us in that direction. But hey, you know, we're all you know trying there. So cheers.
Oh, yeah. If anybody has one, please speak now or forever hold your peace.
Okay. Any other questions? I wonder if I could ask you fine-grained. Sorry, was I breaking up there?
Oh, briefly, I think you're back.
Okay, great. So the picture that's coming out of these very detailed studies of unfolding ERP components seems to be, and in response to your response you gave to Annika's question, seems to indicate that essentially there's multiple components to what ends up being rated as the eventual confidence rating. And I'm just wondering how you think about that readout process and whether there's essentially, is there a additional processing stage that you're averaging over here that in a sense needs to integrate different aspects, the response aspect, the CPP peak and so on. I'm just wondering whether there's any more mechanistic model of how those could be combined. And maybe the one way of going about that is to actually develop some behavioral model that can fit these components to the report. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about how you might pursue that.
Yeah, that's a hard question. Thank you for that, though. So I feel like one of the I think as sort of Annika also really nicely highlighted that you know, looking across data sets and that we might find sort of different patterns of data across this. I think it'll be really important to sort of verify the landscape of what are all the sort of correlates that we might consider, and we're really interested in looking at that in a systematic way at the moment. In terms of the sort of what I guess sort of combines these pieces of evidence into making a continuous confidence judgment, I'm wondering if really locking this down in a very specific sort of boring task that, you know, accounts for these different things might be really fruitful to apply with something like, I know a lot of sort of categorization theory from mathematical psychology, you know, looks at the weightings of these different sources of information in distinguishing between categories. And so in this sense, I'm also thinking of sort of memory recognition memory models that we've been doing some joint neural modeling with. We have, in these cases, we have a sort of front end, which is almost a categorization model, you know, weighing the different sources of information, and then a back end, which is a diffusion model process, where these are sort of combined into some thing. I feel like we might need to really do a small N, like massive amounts of trials per person to try to fit these and get these together. But I'd be really interested to see what these sort of weightings come about, and whether I feel like maybe the orbital frontal cortex, that sort of account that you've especially sort of uncovered as being maybe correlating with these sort of summed sources of evidence, might be a really nice sort of neural correlate to start with that. Yeah, if we can get sort of enough behavior and a willing enough participant, I think maybe we could make a little bit of progress, I hope.
All right, great. Okay, well, if there's not any other questions, then let's end it there. And if we could unmute and thank Daniel again for a great talk.
And thank you so much for dropping by and for having me as well.
All right, good to see everyone. See you at the next one. That was great. Thanks, Daniel. That was really interesting. Yeah, and thanks also for giving a tour of the literature. I think it's important for students who are just starting out and joining this kind of group to get a sense of what's been done. And often in these kind of talks, you don't always get that. So yeah, that was much appreciated.
I'm really glad, because I was worried I was just going to bore people to tears. But on the other hand, I thought maybe it was, yeah, I remember me being a student and learning about this. And so I hope it's been a nice tour of, I feel like the ERP confidence area has been a little bit of a, not a side saddle, but, it's sort of been developing a little bit independently, I think, from the really beautiful behavioral work and fMRI work that's been done.
But I guess that was, no, I agree. It's unfortunate. I think they are a bit siloed. When people write fMRI papers, we tend to cite other fMRI papers, and when we write, yeah, exactly. And so, but I do think that in the line of inquiry that you were suggesting in response to my question at the end was, I see a lot of parallels here with that study that we did, the 2018 paper, where we kind of isolated the medial prefrontal cortex as a candidate integrator, because I think that would go along very well with the idea that essentially, in a decision process, in any decision process, you've got a complex unfolding of calculations going on under the hood, right? And any of those could, as Annika said, like any of those could go wrong, essentially. And in a Bayesian account, you've got various sources of uncertainty that you need to marginalize over to come up with some integrated number which says, right, I'm 70% confident on this trial. And so I think there is a lot of parallel with what has been happening in the fMRI literature, where it started as being like, this is the neural correlate of confidence. And now I think most people think that's just a bit of a nonsensical question. There isn't a neural correlate of confidence. There's neural correlates of distinct monitoring processes, distinct types of uncertainty that need to get somehow integrated or somehow arranged to support some metacognitive judgment. So it'd be nice to have more integration between the ERP side, because it's interesting to hear that it seems to be going in a similar direction on your side as well.
Yeah, it's I guess I think that one of the resurgences as well, also having that like clear computational goal, I guess, has been a real appeal of working in this area, as well as, we've almost got some sort of really nice scaffolding to, we almost know, like, we've got to calculate this thing. So how do we get that? Right. Which is, I've really liked maybe this sort of, I don't know if that's sort of resurgence, but this sort of focus, especially in your group as well, on, this experiment design and how we can sort of more clearly define these concepts. I feel like that's provided, maybe given this area, maybe a safe harbor from a lot of noise, and like given us a chance to grapple with these complexities, as in, even with the your last question, I guess maybe in some of those cases, the sources of information that inform confidence judgments are probably likely to be different, or not radically, but slightly different across tasks. And I feel like it's been really nice because we've got that sort of sweet spot of we don't really know what's happening, but we have the tools to do it or something. So yeah, but I'm kind of excited. I know that I feel like math psychs are a little bit dismissive of cognitive neuroscientists a lot of the time. But I feel like maybe there's a lot that we could still sort of integrate, or that that tradition of experimental psychology. I feel like this is still a very deep well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, fingers crossed. Cool. All right. Well, yeah, thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your holiday. And yeah, and good luck with the talk on Friday. Unfortunately, I won't be able to make it because I'll be, I think it's an in-person event, right? So, which is nice, but also means I won't be able to be there this week. But yeah, thanks again, Daniel, for this. It was a really nice session, and it's good to meet you. And yeah, let's stay in touch.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Again, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, the short version of the other talk is just that predictive coding people might be a little bit wrong. That's all you need to know. But it's really nice to get to chat to you in person as well. And yeah, sorry we sent Will at an inopportune time as well.
I'm just sorry about that. It was really unfortunate. Because it was, we were all geared up to have him with us and be, that was really rubbish for him. Yeah, but it's the way things go. It was an adventure for him.
That's it. He landed on his feet, so it's but yeah, cool.
Okay, all right. Well, enjoy the rest of your holiday. Safe travels to London, and good luck Friday.
No worries. Thank you very much.
Okay, take care. Bye.